Welcome to Just Liberty, where justice and liberty meet. I'm Bettina Krause, editor of Liberty Magazine, and I'm here with my co-host Alan Reineck, who is executive director of the Church State Council. And we're trying to recover religious liberty from the political extremes. So, Alan, we are tackling a really interesting topic today, history, and why history isn't just about the past.
Well, no, it's not about the past, and not just history, but Thomas Jefferson, one of my favorite subjects, and the use and abuse of Thomas Jefferson and his views on religious freedom in modern political discourse and also in the Supreme Court, which has really done a turnabout in how they relate to Jefferson and Madison and our founding fathers.
It's interesting that our understanding of what America is really founded on all these sort of unconscious or sort of barely conscious ideas we've absorbed through the years about how our country was founded and what our founding fathers or framers of the Constitution set out to achieve in America. And, I've discovered time and time again that when I talk to people, some of these unconscious beliefs about history really do have a practical outcome in how they relate to America today.
Well, listening to you, it strikes me that in European countries, for example, it's not so much about the history of the founding, but, it's about being French or being English or being German. Being Italian.
Or Australian.
Right? Or Australian. Well, you guys have a certain history too. But, with America, it's not so much about any sort of ethnic or, identity as much as it is what our founding fathers did and what that means to us. But with that, let's jump right into our guest who is an expert on Thomas Jefferson.
We are delighted today to have with us Dr. Earl Warren Throckmorton, who is a psychologist, and for many years he was a professor of psychology at Grove City College in Grove City, Pennsylvania. And together with Michael Coulter, he's the co-author of a book called Getting Jefferson Right, Fact-Checking Claims About Our Third President. And he's currently hosting a new podcast called Telling Jefferson Lies. So welcome, Warren.
Oh, great. Thanks for having me.
So I am absolutely intrigued about this whole idea of fact-checking claims about our third president. Now, back in 2012, there was an incident where a book was pulled from publication by Thomas Nelson Publishers. Can you give us, just in a nutshell, some of the background to that story?
Sure. I had been fact-checking David Barton. David Barton is a self-proclaimed historian. He has no historical training. He's got a bachelor's degree from Oral Roberts, but he's become quite popular among Christian nationalists, the Christian Right, as a writer of history books, and he speaks a lot on history, the founding era in particular. And he was announced that he was going to come out with a history book on Thomas Jefferson. I had become interested in matters of church and state for reasons that we'd probably need a whole nother episode of your podcast to go into, but I had started to fact check him. And many of those early fact checks were on matters related to Thomas Jefferson. So when I heard he was coming out with a book, I thought, well, I'll put together some of my blog posts, because I'd published these on my blog. I'll put together those things and make a white paper, maybe, and distribute them and kind of be ready for this book when it came out. Well, there were so many of them, I thought, well, this is turning into a book. And it needed to be more than a white paper because there were so many of these things. And they were so critical to his Christian nation mythology. So I approached my friend Michael Coulter, who's a political science professor at Grove City College. He was doing some work at McDonald's, and I used to go there all the time to grade papers and such and work on this book. So I approached him, and he said he'd glad to do it, kind of on a lark, really, because he hadn't thought about it. I mean, he didn't even really know that much about David Barton. So we embarked on this project. We got it done in about, I don't know, 3 or 4 months. And it was a little ebook at first through Amazon. But we took on a lot of the claims, and we had it done within a month of Barton's book coming out, because I had gotten a pre-publication copy of the Jefferson Lies, which I'm sure they wish they hadn't sent me. At least at first, they probably wished that. But anyway, it had this outsized influence. The book was reviewed by quite a number of scholars. I'm not a historian, but fact-checking David Barton's so easy, even a psychologist can do it. And so we put together this book, and even George Marsden, kind of the dean of Christian historians, said it was, gave it thumbs up. And we had a number of Christian historians that wrote about it and gave it, good blurbs and so forth. But anyway, to make a long story shorter, by the end of the summer, Barton had won an award, so to speak, for least credible history book in print from the History News Network. And they called on us to kind of write the, I guess you'd say, entry blurb for it. That got picked up in the New York Times. And our book got reviewed in not reviewed, but I mean, it got talked about a little bit in the New York Times. And then there was a group of pastors in Cincinnati, African-American, Jewish, Messianic pastors, and some historians who lived there, who threatened to boycott Thomas Nelson over this book, because over David Barton's book, because it whitewashed Jefferson's record on slavery and race. Their claims are very specific, and they were very true, very accurate. Now, I have since, here's the upshot. The upshot is that Thomas Nelson pulled the book. Unprecedented in publishing. In their history, they had never pulled a book from publication, and they've published some awful books. And they published books that they later found had plagiarism in them and errors in them. They published some books by Mark Driscoll that had, plagiarism in them, but they corrected those. This book, they said, was beyond correction. I later, after that happened, just recently in preparation for this podcast I'm doing, I got to interview some of the people behind the scenes. Now, they didn't want to be named, but I did get to interview them off the record, or not. I mean, they said I could say this publicly, but they didn't want to be named, so anonymously. And they just said it was beyond correction. There were so many things wrong that they couldn't fix it. So that's what happened.
We published a brochure even, a decade, well, maybe 15 years before all of this happened, called Wall Builders or Myth Builders, because the whole premise, just a short, like 10-point takedown of Barton. But, to me, Barton is kind of exhibit A of living in a post-truth culture war, where, the facts are what we say they are. They're unhinged and untethered from, historical reality. And I'm afraid, too, that the Supreme Court, with their new mantra about history and tradition, is taking us in that same sort of direction, where history becomes exactly what we want it to be in order to create the future that we want.
Sure. That sounds fine in theory, but how do who writes the history is really a critical, facet of this. Last night I was preparing for the final episode in my podcast, Telling Jefferson Lies. And I was reviewing something that Sandra Day O'Connor had said, in one of her decisions about the Ten Commandments. And she was saying something like, why would we give up a system that works so well for something that others found worked so poorly? And that was in a Ten Commandments case. The dissent, she cast the deciding vote to strike down the Ten Commandments in classrooms in Kentucky schools in McCreary County. Now, in the dissent there, Justice Scalia appealed to history and tradition. It's almost as if he, wrote the prologue to this current Supreme Court. And his history was not very good. He went through a history of church state and so forth, and it wasn't very good. And the Supreme Court justices, for all of their other skills and abilities, are not terribly good historians. And I'm taking my cue from people who know. I mean, other historians tell me that, and just from what I read and can put together myself, it seems like if that's going to be the standard, we're in some trouble, I think.
Bettina, if I may, let me cut to why I think this is not an academic discussion. In my observation of Supreme Court discussion of history over the last 40 or 50 years, pre-2000, Jefferson and Madison were routinely invoked in favor of the separation of church and state, and in discussing what the exceptions would be to, say, government funding of religious education or religion in public schools, that you had a basic rule that church and state are separate, but then they're carving out various sorts of exceptions to it. Post Mitchell versus Helms, kind of the turning point in 2000, and from now on, the Supreme Court continues to invoke Jefferson and Madison, but turning it upside down to support eroding complete abandonment of the separation of church and state, and a complete, contrasting use of the history. So the history of church and state in Virginia still plays a central role, but it's interpreted completely differently.
Right. That's one in our book, Getting Jefferson Right, and I want to just add that we have a second edition out where we really attack that more. We go into that a lot more, where we talk about this idea of what was the separation of church and state about, and we contextualize it. A lot of this argument that you just referred to, the change in jurisprudence on separation, the wall of separation, is ahistorical. It's more interpretive. We tie the what Jefferson meant to his letters, to his words, to what he did. One of the claims about Jefferson is that he didn't have much to do with the content of the First Amendment. That he was in Paris, so what? So what? He didn't have anything to do with it. Well, he didn't have anything to do with it if you don't count the statute for religious freedom that Madison carried through, and then of course Madison helped to in a similar manner steward the First Amendment. But there's more. Jefferson wrote at least 27 letters to at least 15 different people begging for religious freedom, the free press, all the First Amendment rights that we are apparently trying to throw away in the modern day. And Jefferson changed Madison's mind on this. Madison didn't want a Bill of Rights initially. And even some of his colleagues didn't want to sign the Constitution over it. And he said, well, we don't need one. And, was skeptical that they would be of much value. Jefferson changed his mind, along with other things, but Jefferson mainly. And that correspondence with Madison and the correspondence with others that leaked into the debates over the Constitution, Jefferson had tremendous impact on the First Amendment. This ahistorical reimagining of Jefferson is one of the things we hope to combat in our book.
Warren, what fascinates me about this whole discussion is the extent to which these myths have seeped down into the consciousness of many American Christians today. My daughter attends a Christian school, and she came home one day and said, "Our teacher told us today that Thomas Jefferson didn't believe in the separation of church and state, and that's a lie told by secularists." So, these ideas are seeping down into, a broad cross-section of Christians who are then acting in ways in our civic space which we could characterize as unchristian. So can you draw that line between how these myths are connected with what we're seeing today with the rise of Christian nationalism?
Well, it's been coming for quite a while. I think that, you mentioned that before his book was pulled, you all had been writing about it. And so you have this long view too, as well. You know that this is the disregard for the separation of church and state has been a long time coming. This is a project. This isn't, and David Barton has said this, that this is a marathon, not a sprint, for him and his, compadres. And so we're seeing the fruit of that now. So what we're seeing in the courts and in various places, Christian schools, like you suggested. I mean, when Michael Coulter and I were writing our book, we had a hard time finding any history professors that didn't disagree with us. We are now seeing, and it's been surprising to me to see that there's it's not quite that way, and that what you said, while it's still somewhat shocking to me, and maybe later you can tell me where that is, I'd be curious. It is happening more frequently that this notion that the separation of church and state was not actually what the founders intended. It's becoming more common, and it does. It affects the way we see church-state relations. It certainly is given the Christian nationalists more fuel for their fire, and it emboldens them. This idea that we really could, within the constitutional framework, have a Christian establishment. I don't know what history these folks are reading.
Let me drill down on one kind of key point of Barton's whole approach, which is the notion of the one-way wall, right? The idea that, well, okay, when Jefferson talks about a wall of separation, he wants to keep the government out of the church, but not the church out of the government. Thinking about, just the concept of Jefferson lies, Jefferson was at least as suspicious of clerical power as he was of, government tyranny, wasn't he?
Oh, certainly. I'm thinking of a correspondence between Jefferson and Benjamin Rush, where Rush wrote him and extolled the virtues of Christianity for Republican government. And, this Jefferson certainly was aware and believed that religion was beneficial. He probably leaned Unitarian, if anything. Did believe in a final judgment, But he was very zealous to keep any church away from the powers of the state. And he wrote Rushback and was indignant, kind of, that he was I'm paraphrasing, but he wanted to make sure that these denominations, I think he named the Congregationalists in particular, knew that any power given to him was going to thwart their aspirations to establish the state church. And he was hoping that sanity was returning to the nation, such that there would not be any hope that they would have that he would help their desires to establish a state church. So, I mean, if you read what he had to say about the subject, there shouldn't be any question about what Jefferson meant by the wall of separation.
So we've been talking a lot about this wall of separation, but what are some of the other myths that are commonly told about Thomas Jefferson? What are some of the specific narratives which American Christians are being exposed to?
Well, I think that this is probably a little bit on the other side of things. Some are told that maybe a little bit more to the left of center, that Jefferson was not religious at all. Jefferson was certainly heterodox. He was not orthodox. That's one of the things that we address in the Jefferson Lies, that Barton wrote in the Jefferson Lies. But Jefferson, he did indeed take a couple of Bibles and cut up the Gospels and create a little book of morals of just what he thought Jesus said. He said it was as easy as selecting diamonds from a dunghill. That what was actually what Jesus said, and not what the disciples put in there to embellish Jesus' claim to deity. He didn't believe Jesus was God or even claimed to be God. If he did, it was a little diluted, he thought. And so, but he still had a belief that Jesus' morals were the best there ever was, and that there was a final state of judgment in the afterlife. So he wasn't a complete naturalist. And that might frustrate some who want to see Jefferson as a complete naturalist or, an atheist even, something along those lines. And I think that it's important to balance out that picture. Is Jefferson encouraged seeking truth. He encouraged seeking things that were in, whether it was religion or not. Now, one thing that, and this may be a little off from your question, but I think it's important to mention is one of the things that Barton tries to do is whitewash Jefferson in his record. One of the things that we...
Literally, because you mentioned slavery.
Yes, exactly. And, one of the things that we discovered in our work was just how much Jefferson did promote slavery toward the middle and end of his career as a slave owner. He did have a lot of negative things to say about slavery early on in his life, and if his life had ended after the Northwest Ordinance work and statements about not expanding slavery into the Northwest Territories, he might have been viewed as a civil rights icon like Barton wants him to be. But he eventually expanded slavery into the Louisiana Territory. And he encouraged his neighbors to invest in owning slaves. And this is so much different than the picture painted by Barton and by the Christian nationalists. They want to whitewash the whole thing. And this is one of the things that, you ask how we seeing this play out today. One of the ways we're seeing just the whole whitewashing of history play out today is a minimization of the minority experience in this country. And Jefferson is kind of the embodiment of that. Because here's a person who talks a great game when it came to civil rights. All men are created equal. Surely these people shall be free. I tremble when I think of that my God is just. But then he owns people. And he sends slave catchers to get them when they run away. He says that you should invest in slaves because slave women bear children, and that's part of your increase in value of your slave holdings. He allows slavery to go into Louisiana slave territory. So yes, he ends the slave trade internationally, but he allows it to flourish in the American slave trade. Virginia becomes the center of this.
It strikes me, Warren,
America.
It strikes me that you've just opened the door to another subject that we're going to have to pursue at length because, a kissing cousin, so to speak, of Christian nationalism is American exceptionalism. And what I hear in your discussion is the notion that, America is special, America is blessed by God, we're exceptional, and so we kind of downplay any of the stains in our history. And we present a history about all the positives, and there's lots of positives in American history, but there's also lots of negatives. And, it's all part of a very messy story. Like you use the term whitewash. So I think American exceptionalism is going to be another topic for more discussion.
Right. And I think that's why the whole notion of a Christian nation is pretty preposterous. When you actually look at what happened, how could a Christian nation do those things? Take land from the indigenous people, treat them the way that they were treated, and of course, racially based slavery. Sure, a lot of good things went on, but you can't really call the nation Christian when they do those other things. And so, as you say, the Christian Nationalist Project relies on minimizing the downside so that they can maintain the myth of a particularly unusually, outstandingly Christian beginning. And that's really where I think a lot of the history is so important to them to maintain that myth.
Well, Warren, thank you so much for joining us today. And for our listeners, I'd encourage you to check out Warren's book, Getting Jefferson Right, and also his podcast, Telling Jefferson Lies. As Alan says, I think there's a chapter 2 discussion in there to pursue. So thank you for being with us.
All right, my pleasure. Thank you.
Bettina, I'm really excited about this interview because Jefferson and how we understand Jefferson and his colleagues really is shaping American law and has such a prominent role in the culture wars today. It's such an important topic, and he brought wonderful perspective to bear.
What for me really came home was this whole history and tradition approach to constitutional jurisprudence that the Supreme Court has adopted. I mean, our conversation today showed that history is not black and white. It's not clear cut. It's open to interpretation, and people can come to polar opposite opinions on who said what and who meant what. And if we're taking that as our standard for understanding fundamental constitutional protections like the First Amendment, for instance, I think we're standing on pretty shaky ground.
Well, but there's also, the kind of the political construct of history. I think if I have my quote correct, George Orwell, in observing the Soviet Union, famously said, "He who controls the past controls the future."
Yeah, how true. How true. Well, it's been an interesting discussion, and I think we will be returning to it many, many times in the future. I'm Bettina Krause here with Alan Reineck for Just Liberty, where justice and liberty meet. We'll talk to you next time.